Hello dear students, today I will describe some subjects in chapter 1. Chapter 1 grade 12 chemistry consists of what includes what? Chapter 1 In chapter 1 you have what? Ions. In aqua solution and collegative properties. The chapter is divided by two parts. In part A, we study the ions. Ions, it form from which compounds after dissolving in water gives the ions. And in part B of this chapters, we study the collegative properties. About the ion, when compound dissolves in water, which compounds that form from two opposite ions after breaking bonds between them form ions. So compound after dissolving form ions, but ask about the form ions. Can we say all compounds when dissolves in water give same moles of ions, or we have different mole of ions? For example, we have two containers. In first one, we're adding NaCl. In second one, Ca is Cl2. NaCl, when dissolves in water, separated to which two parts of the ions? Separated to Na and Cl. Gives 1 mole of Na and 1 moles of Cl ions. After summation, the totals becomes what? 2 mole. But CaCl2, these numbers under Cl culture subscribed form from the oxidation numbers of Ca. Separate to Ca and to Cl, always subscribe becomes the coefficient for what? For the same ions. After we have 1 moles of Ca and 2 moles, the summation becomes what? 3 moles of ions. Look at the total moles of ions. After dissolving the compounds in water, we have 2 and more than 2 moles of ions. This process in chemistry called what? Dissociation. What's the dissociation and how we define the dissociation? Dissociation, when ionic compound dissolves in water, form ions or separate ions in ionic compound after dissolving in water, called dissociation. Look, dear students, ionic compound. Which one becomes ionic compound in chemistry? Ionic compound includes what? Strong base and salt. Strong base. Only in chemistry, strong base and salt becomes ionic compound. Except strong base and salt, all compounds in chemistry calls molecules. Calls what? Molecules. Strong base, for example, NaOH, KOH, LiOH, CaOH by 2, the compounds that produces hydroxide, completely called strong base. Salt, NaCl, salt, K2SO4, salt, NaNO3. Salt is a compound in chemistry that form from the reaction between acids and base. Cancelled H in acid and cancelled OH in base. Combined between cation of base and anion of acid, the compound results becomes what? Becomes salt. So how we define the dissociation? Ionic compound. Which one becomes ionic compound in chemistry? Only strong base and salt. Strong base and salt. Other compounds in chemistry called what? Molecules. Some examples about the dissociation. How we solve the questions about the dissociation. First example. We have these questions and this year from the elementary. How many moles of ions produces? How many moles how many moles of ions are produced by dissociation 0.5 mole of sodium phosphate. Of what? Sodium phosphate. Sodium phosphate. About the solving for these questions. First, write the chemical formula for sodium phosphate. For sodium phosphate, sodium is Na. Phosphate is what? PO4. About the charge for each one. About the charge for each one. About the charge for each one. Each one. 1 positive Na, 3 negative PO4. In compounds, always the sum oxidation numbers after summation, so it becomes what? 0. 1, 3. Cross product 2 becomes Na3PO4. Write the solid compounds in what? Left side. When dissolves in water, separated to what? 3 Na and 1 PO4. 1 PO4. We have which moles of Na? 3. Multiply by the coefficients of the compounds, 0.5. 0.5 says 0.5 mole of sodium phosphate produces which moles of ions? 1.5. 1.5. 1 mole of PO4 multiplied by 0.5, 0.5. If question asks about the determining cation ions, find the mole of cation, you say is equals to what? 1.5. If asked about the parts of the anion, negative ions, you say it becomes what? 0.5. But about these questions in ministry, says find the total moles of ions. Total moles of ions. Yani after summation becomes what? 2 mole of ion. So to determining mole of ions, first write the equation for the dissociation ionic compound. In left side we have solid compound. In left side, in right side we have what? Ions. But sometimes, dear students, sometimes instead of mole of compound, gives what? Molarity and volume. Molarity times volume per liter, it becomes mole. So first you find the mole of compounds when we have molarity and volume. Or sometimes gives what? Mass. Mass over molar mass. Mass over molar mass, it becomes mole. And first we finding the mole after we determining the mole of each ion sometimes or total moles of ions. For example, another example is about the dissociation. 0.55 liter of ammonium sulfide, and the concentration, it becomes 2 molarity. Says what? Find the mole of cation ions, only the parts of the cation, positive. Find mole of what? Cation ions. Cations means what? Positive. First, for solving these questions, first we find the mole of compound. By what? We have molarity and volume. Mole equal molarity times liter. 2 times 0.75, it becomes what? 1.5 mole. 1.5 mole of what? 1.5 mole of what? Of the compounds. Which compounds? Ammonium sulfide. Ammonium sulfide. For determining ammonium, NH4 in compounds after dissociation gives 2 moles, and we have 2 moles of what? of the cation ions. 2 times mole of compound, 2 times 1.5, it becomes what? 3 moles. It becomes what? 3 moles. So about the determining mole of each ions or total moles of ions, first we needed the mole of compound. Sometimes directly gives the mole of compounds, like we have this question in Ministry 2023 elementary question 1, and we have in 2022 first theorem, molarity and volume. After multiply between them, first we finding mole, after that determining the mole of what? Of the ion. Another examples about the dissociation. In this case, it gives what? Mole of ions. When you have mole of ions, how are you finding the mole of compound? Look. For example, which mole of CdCl2 are dissociate to form 4 moles of Cl ions, 4 moles of anion ions, A2, B4, C8, D6. Look about this question. In this question we have what? The mole of ions. For the determining the mole of compounds, you have more than one type, one types of way. First way, directly write the mole of the given ions in here. About this ratio. This what? Gives ion. And just write what? Mole of ion in compound. Mole of ions in compounds. We have which moles of Cl? 2. 4 divided by 2 should be what? 2. So 2 moles of CdCl2 produces 4 moles of ions. This is directly by ions. We solve this one directly. 4 mole of ions divided the mole of the ions in compound gives what? The mole of compound. Second way. Write the equation for the dissociation of CdCl2. In left side we have CdCl2 solid. In water gives what? Cd and 2Cl. AQ. 1 mole of CdCl2 gives which moles of Cl2? When we have 4 moles of Cl, how are you finding the moles of CdCl2? Cross product Y equals 4/2. It becomes what? 2 moles. This is what? Long way for determining the moles of ions. Write the equation for the dissociation CdCl2, and in right side write the ions, then write the relation between the compounds with the ions. That gives an equation to determine the moles of what? Compounds. This question. Which of the following compounds are dissociate to form Na and PO4? A, NaPO4. B, NaPO4 by 3. C, Na3PO4. D, Na2PO4 by 3. About these questions, also you have these questions in ministry. Which of the following compounds produces Na and PO4 in right side for the chemical equation. Na and PO4, it's two ions, after combining together produces the sodium phosphate. But which formula becomes true formula? True. Na, positive 1. PO4, negative 3. Always the sum oxidation numbers for the compounds after summations becomes what? 0. If it's not equals to 0, write 3 under Na and 1 PO4. 3 times 1, 3. 3 times 1, 3. Positive 3, negative 3 becomes 0. So the true structures for sodium phosphate is what? NH3PO4. The true answers for this question says what? C. This about, dear students, about the dissociation. Dissociation is what? Which compounds cause dissociation, and which compounds, when produces ion after dissolving in water, cause dissociation. How you determine the moles of ions, how you determine the moles of each ions, how you determine the total moles of ions. Now we have what? Precipitation, reaction, PPT, precipitation. Precipitation in chemistry calls what? Insoluble. Insoluble when does not dissolves in water. We don't have in chemistry the compounds that completely not dissolves in water, but mostly becomes insoluble. So in this case, the compounds called what? Precipitation. About the precipitation, which compounds in chemistry become soluble and which compounds becomes insoluble, for the solubility of the compounds it dissolves in water or not, it depends on the tables you memorized. First point, for the soluble and insoluble compounds, any compound that contains sodium, ammonium, potassium, nitrate, acetate, chlorate, all are soluble. For example, NaCl, soluble because contains Na. KBr, soluble because contains what? K. Number 2, most chloride compounds are soluble, except Cl, when combined with what becomes insoluble? AgCl. Mercury positive 1, diatomic, Ag2Cl2, and PbCl2 in cold water. But in hot water becomes soluble. So Cl only in 3 compounds becomes insoluble. AgCl, Ag mercury 1, not a 2. Look, not 2. AgCl2, this is soluble. But Ag2Cl2 becomes what? Insoluble. And PbCl2 in cold water also becomes what? Insoluble. 3. Most SO4 are soluble. SO4, sulfate, when combined with which metals becomes insoluble? Except BaSO4, CaSO4, AgSO4, PbSO4, SrSO4 all become what? Insoluble. So most sulfate compounds become soluble, except when combined with 5 elements: BaCa, Ag, Pb, Sr. Another point about the precipitation, you have what? PO4, silicate, carbonate are insoluble, except when combined with what becomes soluble? NaKNH4. You study in first point. In first point, I say NaNH4, K compounds all becomes what? Soluble. Last point about the solubility for the solid compounds. Most sulfide compounds are insoluble. Insoluble, not dissolves in water except CaS, SRS, Na2S, K2S, and H4 by 2S. Only in those compounds become soluble. So about the precipitate or precipitation or soluble, insoluble compounds, how do you know in chemistry which compounds become soluble? Which one dissolves in water? Which one can able to conduct electricity well and conduct electricity poorly? It depends on these tables you memorized. One example about this one. One example. Ca2 positive in aqua solution when mixed with which solution? Form PPT. Form insoluble compounds. A NaCl, B K2CO3, C MgNO3 by 2, D CH3, COOD, D CH3, COO by 2 SR. About this question, ask about the precipitate. First container contains the Ca ions in aqueous solution. When mixing with which aqueous solution for the following that gives in question, it form precipitate. About these questions in chemistry, count single displacement. Instead of all positive ion, cancel the positive, write Ca. CaCl2 is the soluble. CaCl2, according to table, it becomes soluble because Cl only in those compounds becomes insoluble. CaCO3, carbonate. Carbonate only when combined with NaKNH4 becomes soluble, but in here we have Ca. So B, it becomes the first answer if we don't have other true answers. CaNO3, NO3 compounds also soluble. Acetate is soluble. So the answers for this question is what? CaCO3. CaCO3 becomes what? Insoluble. This first question is about the solubility for the compounds. How do you know which one becomes soluble and which one becomes insoluble? This question also, we have this question in Wizari. Ag or Ba2 positive are form precipitate when combined with which of the following ions? Both of them. Ba, first one, second one, and Ag. When combined with which ions form the precipitate? A, Cl, B, PO4, C, NO3, D, NH4. Look, dear students, Ag when combined with Cl, the compounds becomes insoluble. So AgCl is insoluble, but Ba when combined with Cl becomes soluble. The question asks about the both of them. Two ions after combined with which ions it form the precipitate. So A is wrong. Why it's wrong? Because AgCl is insoluble, but at the same time you have soluble compounds, Ba with Cl. AgPO4 insoluble. Ag3PO4. Ba3PO4 by 2 also it's insoluble. Ag3PO4 when combined with PO4, Ba3PO4 by 2 both becomes insoluble compounds. So the answers for this question you say is what? B. NO3. NO3. All NO3 compounds are soluble, dissolves in water. NH4 we don't have combination between two opposite ions in, yani two positive ions in chemistry. Only we have opposite ions to form the compound. Dear students, after when you know which compounds become soluble, which compounds becomes insoluble, which compounds precipitate on the bottom of the containers, and which one becomes soluble, now we have one subject that depends on this table. It depends. It's what? Net ionic equation. Net ionic equation. What's the net ionic equation? What's the meaning of net ionic equation? Yani equation consists of ions. Two ions, opposite ions. After combined together when form only insoluble compound, this is called net ionic equation. Two ions in aqua solution. Two ions in aqua solution, ions that form from the compound. When two aqua compounds, two compounds when dissolves in water after mixing together, the two ions that form insoluble precipitate. This is called what? Net ionic equation. For net ionic equation, only we have insoluble compounds from the product side and from the right side. Some example about the net ionic equation. Ag plus Cl, AgCl. This net ionic equation for the formation of silver chloride. Ministry question, wizard question asking about the net ionic equation for nickel sulfide. Nickel sulfide, Ni2 positive Aq, S2 negative Aq. Ni is insoluble according to table. This net ionic equation for nickel sulfide, we have this question in administration. Ag2S, silver sulfide, silver. 2Ag positive plus S negative Aq, Aq. When form Ag2S insoluble, this calls what? Net ionic equation. Last examples about this one for what? Calcium phosphate, calcium phosphate, calcium phosphate, calcium phosphate, 3Ca with 1 PO4, Aq. This calls what? Net ionic equation. So how we define the net ionic equation? Net ionic equation when two aqua compounds, solutions combine together and we have change in chemical and we have the new compounds in product side. This calls chemical change, chemical change. Some examples about the net ionic equation. Net ionic equation, it's back to which types of chemical reaction? It's double displacement. Double displacement. Double displacement reaction. One example for the double displacement reaction, we have net ionic equation. About the double displacement, when AB plus CD, AQ, AQ. Mixing together, for example, A, look, A combined with D, C combined with B. It becomes what? AD and CB. Look, the insoluble compounds, when we have insoluble compounds, in product side this is called net ionic equation. But the soluble compounds in product, it becomes spectator ions. Spectator ions. Spectator ions, it's the ions that's remaining before and after reaction. Doesn't include in chemical reaction. So which one becomes spectator ions? The compound that's soluble in product side. After, when you have the insoluble of compounds, after the reaction that occurs between two aqua solutions. This is called double displacement, and in double displacement always gives what? Gives the net ionic equation. This is called insoluble compounds, and the spectator ions is the soluble compounds in product side. Examples about this one. Ag, NO3, AQ, and KCl, AQ. About the mixing between two compounds, if I ask about the net ionic equation, if I ask about the spectator ions, which one becomes spectator ions and which one is net ionic equation? First, write double displacement, double. Ag, NO3 plus KCl. What's the double displacement? Positive combined with negative. AgCl. Positive combined with negative. KNO3. Without written the state for the product, it's called double displacement. When we written the states for the product side, it becomes chemical equation. Chemical. AgCl, it's insoluble according to table when you memorized. This one calls what? Soluble. After, when we written the stage for the compounds into product, this calls chemical equation. Then overall ionic equation. Overall ionic equation for the above one, separate the AQ compounds into two opposite ions. Separate each one. AgNO3, AgNO3 plus KCl, KCl. AgCl, it's insoluble. KNO3 separate, and AgCl doesn't separate its two opposite ions. Why? Because it's insoluble. And this one becomes what? Soluble. Which one becomes spectator ions for this reaction? The ions that's remaining before and after reaction will be cancelled before and after arrow. The remaining becomes net ionic equation. Ag plus Cl becomes what? AgCl. This is called net ionic equation. By long way we solve the net ionic equation and spectator ions by 3 steps: double, overall, and net ionic equation. But if question asks about the which one becomes net ionic equation and which one becomes spectator ions, directly you can determine it. How? AgNO3, KCl, Ag positive combined with negative should be AgCl. K combined with NO3, KNO3. this insoluble, and this one soluble. So which one becomes net ionic equation? AgCl, but Ag when combined with Cl when form AgCl, this net ionic equation. And which one spectator ion? Spectator ion, K and what? NO3. So directly you can determine the net ionic equation and spectator ions for the combination between two solutions by this way. And sometimes instead of spectator ions says what? Which ions does not appear? Which ion does not appear means what? Which one becomes what? Spectator ions. Another example about this one. Ba Cl2 and K2SO4. Which one becomes net ionic equation and which one should be spectator ions and does not appear in aqua solution? Directly, Ba combined with SO4, BaSO4. BaSO4, it's insoluble compounds, this net ionic equation. Ba plus SO4, when becomes BaSO4, is net ionic equation. K and Cl, soluble, separate to its two opposite ions. This is what? Spectator ions. But, after combined between two solutions, both of them are soluble in product side directly by ice. You say the reaction doesn't occur between them. We don't have spectator ions if don't ask about the product side. For example, MgCl2 with K2SO4. MgCl2, when react with K2SO4, these two compound, two solutions, after combined together in product side, both of them become soluble, but does not give in the question the product side. If asked about the reaction will be occur between them or does not occur, he says does not occur because we don't have the insoluble compounds in product side. First conditions about the chemical reaction, if it occurs or not. First conditions form insoluble compounds in product side. When you have precipitate compounds in product side, that is called what? First conditions for the chemical reaction. After when you study the net ionic equation and you know which compounds become soluble and insoluble, all these compounds that form ions, the process called what? Dissociation. Dissociation. Now we have ionization. Ionization, like dissociation, also form the compound, form the ions in compound. But which compounds it can be used for the ionization process? When a molecular electrolyte. When not all molecular, when adding to water, reacted to water, form ions. Not all molecular, only the molecular that becomes electrolyte when react with water form ions, this calls ionization. Which one becomes molecular electrolyte in chemistry? Strong acid, weak acid, weak base, HCl, HI, HNO3, H2SO4, HF, HCN, HNO2, NH3, C5H5N, C6H5NH2. Which compounds in chemistry, if asked about the compound that will be ionized in water? Strong acid, weak base. Strong acid, weak base. All this is the examples for molecular electrolyte. The bonding between molecular electrolyte, for example, HCl, we have partially charged between them. So this bonds between them called polar covalent bond. Polar covalent bond. When water can able to overcoming the covalent bond between HCl, in this case is form the ions, and the process called what? Ionization. Sometimes in wizarding questions ask about the ionization. Which of the following is a molecular compound will be ionized? Molecular compound will be ionized. You chose which one? Strong acid, weak acid, weak base. In which process for the forming of ions? In which process for the forming of ions that the water overcoming the covalent bond? Says ionization. In which of the following compound the water overcoming covalent bond? You choose the, for example, HCl. It's one example for the covalent bond. AgCl. In which of the following compound the attraction between ions is greater than? Attraction between ions greater than means what? Insoluble. Attraction between ions is greater than attraction water to AgCl, to solute. NaCl. Attraction between ions, if it's greater than the attraction between solute, this means what? Insoluble. Means what? Precipitate. NaCl, if the attraction between ions is less than attraction between ions is less than attraction solvent to solute. HF, water overcoming the partially covalent bonds in which compounds? Partially covalent bonds. Why? Because HF is the weak electrolyte, partially ionized to form ion. Change it to ions after react to water and back to form what? To acid molecules. So water overcoming the partial covalent bond. But if question asks about the covalent bond, ask about the effects on the attraction between ions. For covalent bond only, we have what? Ionization. Ministry questions. Dear students, ask about the what? Ask about the ionization. Which of the following compounds undergo ionization? Which of the following compounds undergo ionization means what? Which of the following compound can able to form ions by ionization process? Ionization process includes what? Molecular electrolyte. All molecular electrolyte, it becomes what? Polar. Polar molecular electrolyte. Always electrolyte in chemistry. When define electrolyte, the compound that form ions. So always electrolyte, it becomes what? It becomes what? Polars. Also about the ionization, the compound that contain carbon, hydrogen, except, look, except weak acid, strong acid, weak base. It becomes molecular, but not ionized. Not ionized. Which compounds is amolecular but not ionized? The compound that contains carbon, hydrogen, except strong acid, weak base. For example, C2H5OH. For example, C6H6. For example, C6H12O6. For example, CH3OCH3. All this is a molecular compound, but not ionized in water. If asked about the molecular not ionized, also we have ministry questions about this one. Which of the following is a molecular compound not ionized in water? You choose which one? The compound that contain carbon, hydrogen, and sometimes other elements, except strong acid and weak acid, strong acid, weak base. All three compounds, it becomes what? It becomes the molecular electrolyte and will be what? Ionized. This about what? About the ionization. What's the distinguish between ionization and dissociation? In dissociation, we have ionic compound, strong base salt. But in ionization, we have molecular electrolyte compounds. We have the covalent bond between attraction to opposite ions for the molecular electrolyte. But in dissociation, we have the ionic bond between them. For example, NaCl, NaOH. This differences between ionization and what? Dissociation. Now we have hydronium ions. Hydronium ions, H3O. What's the hydronium ions and which compounds form the hydronium ions? For hydronium ions form from the donated protons in molecular electrolyte. When molecular electrolyte, which one becomes molecular electrolyte? Acid. Acid contains H positive. When molecular electrolyte transfers proton combined with oxygen in water molecules, form hydronium plus negative ions plus energy. Yani always formation of hydronium ions becomes exothermic. Is what? Exothermic. Exothermic causes to increasing temperature. And the vessel becomes what? Becomes hot. What's the hydronium ion? How we define the hydronium ion? Hydronium ions, when the molecular electrolyte, like acid, after donated proton into water combined with oxygen, form hydronium with negative ions and energy. Some questions about this one. Number one. If asked about the endo or exo, the formation of hydronium ions is exothermic. Causes to increasing temperature. Causes to increasing temperature. Number two. How many covalent bonds, equal covalent bonds, does have hydronium ions? It says 3. We have 3 covalent bonds. Has 3 covalent bonds. Last question, this is important. Which one becomes hydrated protons? Hydrated protons. About the hydrated protons, the formula, it applies on this rule. Any numbers of oxygen for hydrogen times 2 plus 1, this calls what? Hydrated protons. When you have 2 oxygen, times 2 plus 1, 5. So this calls what? Hydrated protons. O3, H7. 3 times 2, 6, plus 1, 7, so also it's hydrated protons. O5, H9. 5 times 2, 10, plus 1, 11, and here we have 9. It's not hydrated protons. 4 times 2, 8, plus 1, يعني double for hydrogen, you say is double plus 1. Double plus 1. That's what hydrated protons. يعني about the hydronium ions, molecular electrolyte form hydronium ions. That's first conditions for the determining hydronium ions. And always it becomes exothermic because it releases energy. About the covalent bonds, how many bonds does have hydronium ion? It forms hydronium ion after transfers proton into water combined with oxygen. So it have 3 covalent bonds. And which one becomes hydrated protons? We have 2 questions in Wazari about the hydrated protons. Number of oxygen, double plus 1. For hydrogen, you say hydrated protons. If not equals to double plus 1, you say this one is not hydrated protons. Dear students, next lessons, we continue to chapter 1 and we described other subjects for this chapter. Thank you.